just to invite you to reflect for a moment. What was your first encounter with death? What was the first time you were really struck by the sort of incomprehensibility of death? Probably statistically, among a group this size, some of you probably had, very significant death early on. Maybe the loss of a sibling or a parent when you were still a child, or the first time a grandparent died and the attempt to make sense of that. And we make sense of our experience in different ways, partly according to our temperament and partly according to just whatever capacity, skill, psychological and emotional sophistication we have, right? Which, depending on when you first encountered death, if it was as a child, may not have been very much, of course. And also that in combination with how it's held and handled by the authority figures around us, parents particularly, for example. But it's worth reflecting, I think, so what was it like at the time? What was it like, that first death? Whatever it was, may have been the death of a pet. Not so significant. Who died isn't necessarily so significant as that first relationship we made with the fact of death. Right? Oh, those we love go, disappear, never to return, in a way that's kind of hard to make sense of often, the first time it happens, certainly as a child. I remember that, the losing of a pet, just hard to make sense of it, them not coming back, them not being there. And actually, for me as a teenager, a big part of that first encounter with death wasn't actually the death of someone. It was moving to a place where we lived next to a busy road, and that on the way home from school I had to walk, after the bus would drop me, I had to walk this sort of maybe 500 meters on a busy road with no pavement. And so all these cars came vroom, vroom, very close by. And just that weirdness of, on the one hand, feeling so alive. And then in theory, I'm like 50 centimeters from certain death. And every day, just that walking home and that, like, not being able to make sense of the contrast between so alive, and yet if I just did that, if I just so dead, and not being able to make sense of so dead. And the very fact that we can't make sense of death, and then of course we carry on. Oh, well, how did that relationship with death go on as you got used to more death? I wonder what the average amount of close people that we've lost, if we somehow totaled them up in the room and averaged them out between all of us, in different ages. But we've all lost people. We've all lost people. And so we kind of, on some ways, get used to that, and yet, in what ways do we not really get used to it? It seems to me there's certainly a kind of a certain cognitive inhibition against death, in as much as we can't really grok it. What's death? Anybody? What's death? Right? What happens when you die? So in terms of the cognitive and emotional and just physiological sort of impediments to really meeting death, and I think they're all worthy of attention. So the cognitive impediment is just that, the fact that we can't get our heads around it, literally. We can't understand death. We don't know what happens when we die. We can't anticipate death, really. And so what we tend to do with that cognitive inhibition is either we come up with a story to believe in, right? So, we've got the various religious stories about what happens after death, but they really are, they're stories, right? Or we come up with another, the more sort of scientific, materialistic, we live in scientific materialism is in a way our religion, the religion of our culture in which we've grown up more predominantly than the other religions. And so that story says, it's all over, we rot in the ground and there's nothing else. That's also a story, we don't know that either. Or, so we come up with some story which means we no longer really have to confront it. Because I've got a story, that's what's going to happen to me. Or, we don't feel able to settle for a story, or we don't want to settle for a story, and we say we're agnostic, maybe, I don't know. But often, I think, for many of us, where we say we don't know, it's not an active not knowing. It's not actually a staying in the incapacity to know, and therefore the alive mysteriousness of, wow, I'm on my way to certain death, and I have no idea what that means. Wow. No, it tends to be a more kind of, it's like we say, I don't know. I'm agnostic. And what that really means is I put it aside and don't give it any thought. Because it's kind of uncomfortable to wrestle with complete uncertainty. Right? We find certainty much more comfortable, mostly. So uncertainty is disorientating, and so we just put it aside. And then there's a kind of the emotional inhibition or impediment, right? Is that often we just feel uncomfortable with the idea of death. It's seen, the two most common words I hear. So I said to somebody yesterday, he said, what are you in London for? I said, I'm teaching a day about death reflection. I was like, weirdo. Right, interested in death. Morbid and depressing. That's what death is. Morbid and depressing. Right, that's the sense that, it's something uncomfortable. And we see the whole cultural way in which we sideline death and we kind of avoid death, and we tend to not see it very much. That's not the same universally. In fact, it's not been the same for most places in most times throughout most of history and most cultures. Right? Is that we haven't been as avoidant of death as we are these days. Mostly when people died, you'd can see them. And I'm sure some of you have seen dead bodies, and maybe you've been the one to discover a relative who's died. But within the wider culture, it's sort of it's put away in many ways. And I remember going to the funeral of one of my grandparents, and just the fact that I couldn't see them. I hadn't seen them dead, and all I could see was this sort of polished wooden box, and the polishing of the coffin and the polishing of the handles seemed just so irrelevant. I didn't want to see polished handles and polished boxes. I wanted to see my grandfather. And so we often kind of deny ourselves the possibility of really, meeting that. And those of you who have, if you've sat with a dead body, there's something very powerful about it, right? There's something very powerful about the familiarity. Here's this person that I've known and loved, and we somehow see what I've known and loved about them is their life. They were animated. When they spoke, their eyes shone and their cheeks moved, and they made these interesting sounds that I could make sense of. And they were warm and they hugged me. And now, on the one hand, they're clearly just not there anymore. There's just this lump of flesh. And yet this lump of flesh so clearly is that person that I loved and knew. And yet this lump of flesh so clearly isn't that person that I loved and knew. So we get to the confrontation with that is actually quite helpful in making sense, or at least in digesting that which we can't really make sense of. So, as well as these kind of life events, and we may have the opportunity to sit with a loved one when they die, or etc. then the contemplative traditions have kind of brought in these ways of entering into relationship with death, ways of befriending death, ways of going through what are otherwise these impediments, so that we actually, can befriend death, can live in the light of death. And then the physiological impediment, right, is like, for example, what happens. I think this is one of the most interesting and most powerful ways to meet death as a practice. We'll do this as a practice in a moment. What happens at the end of the out-breath? So mostly, most people, most of the time, aren't giving any attention to their breath, right? Except when if you really exerted yourself and you're out of breath, and then you might. Mostly, we just don't. Why would you attend to breathing? It's the most boring, ordinary thing, unless you're a meditator, and then suddenly, breath. So what happens at the end of every single out-breath? Well, mostly, almost nothing happens. Mostly, there's just an in-breath. But actually, there's a world of death at the bottom of the in-breath. There's a silence. There's a space. There's a vastness. There's a depth. And there's peace. At the bottom of an out-breath, there's a breath has kind of three parts to the cycle. Right? There's the in-breath, the out-breath, and then the vast, silent, deathly, empty peace at the bottom. There isn't really a fourth. There isn't really another bit at the top of the in-breath, right? Unless you're tense. If you're tense, you might hold at the top of the in-breath. But actually, if you're relaxing, everything's happening naturally. It's like if you throw a ball up in the air, right? There's not really there is of course a moment where up becomes down, but it's sort of part of the same momentum. In-breath, out-breath. But at the bottom of the out-breath, there's a whole other part of the breath. And mostly it's just brief. And if we're quite active, it's necessarily brief because you need to kind of you need oxygen again quite quickly. But if we're a bit still and we're relaxed, that third part of the breath can actually open up quite a lot. So, but often it doesn't. And it doesn't because of what I would say is this physiological resistance or impediment to contemplating death. On the one hand, these qualities that we speak about in meditation, peace, vastness, depth, it's like, yeah, sign me up. I wish I could get some of that in my practice, right? I get tired legs, wandering mind, etc. What I really want is depth and vastness and peace. Except, it turns out actually we're a bit afraid of peace and vastness and depth. Because we tend to lose ourselves. We don't know who we are. What is the usual way? We recognize ourselves, and in fact we maintain the familiarity of ourselves, me. Right? My name, my identity, my roles, my relationships, my interests, my preferences, my wishes, my dramas, my stories, my work, my. We retain the sense of that and the momentum of all that through a familiarity of the I thought, what the Buddha calls ahankara, I-making activity, right? Selfing. When we stop and meditate, we think, oh yeah, nice, peace. But we still, blimey, it's still going on. So much. So in some ways, the invitation of this kind of practice is letting the ahankara die. Right? Not die in some kind of final, with some sort of finality, not with some strange idea that, there should be no more thinking. If there was no more thinking, you'd be in a right mess. Right? Just kind of lobotomized. And yet, in the moment, to let this thought die, to let this breath die, to enter into the space at the bottom of the out-breath, is to enter into a quality of peace, a quality of vastness, a quality of depth, or often has a feel of a kind of vast, inky darkness, a little bit like the night sky. Night sky, which again we know is infinite, and yet which can't make sense of infinite. It's very much like death. Death has a kind of infinitude to it, and we can't make sense of that. So one very kind of interesting, helpful, powerful way to start to really engage with death, and really engage with it, not just thinking about it, right? But to really engage is to become very interested in that space at the end of the out-breath. And on the one hand, as I say, that means opening the possibility of resting into that silence, quietude, openness, etc. That might be very brief at the beginning, and yet as we confront that physiological resistance to that, and as we get a little more familiar with sort of quiet abiding, or what we could call a non-abiding, thoughtless abiding, on the one hand we get to really taste that, and we get to recognize it somehow, that the relationship with that peace and silence at the bottom of the out-breath is a sort of an echo or a parallel to our relationship with death. And at the same time, in doing that same practice, we get to encounter the physiological resistance. Right? We get to encounter that part of us that just, for example, suddenly it's like, oh God, breathe in already. Breathing in, I feel like me again. And then as we go along, we realize, feeling like me again is kind of a drag, actually. Feeling like me again means same old neuroses, same old restlessness, same old delusions. Let me come back to feeling that peace. I want to put down my delusions and but then we get there, don't know who I am again, and breathe in, etc., etc. That's one way of describing, the wheel of samsara. Wanting to get rid of my delusions, and then when I actually face into the melting, not knowing where I am, picking them up again. And that's in some ways, that's what the breath cycle is. And that's where the physiological nature of the breath cycle and then the psychological nature of the breath cycle come together.